please keep yourself on mute until asked to take off. Ron will be making this an interactive session, and so we welcome your questions. Please use the chat, and as he speaks, feel free to be typing. I'll be monitoring that, and we will definitely have time for some interaction. And I think at this point now, I'm going to introduce our speaker. You know, he describes himself as an ordinary guy, but I would call him far from that. He has working class roots, and he loves to coach, and he loves to be with people. He has a background in manufacturing. He was a manager in manufacturing. He got his PhD at Fielding, and he now runs a performance improvement firm. And he is a senior adjunct member at the University of Laverne, and he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in organizational behavior. And in his PhD studies, he studied the reflective abilities of individuals at different ego levels, different levels of adult development. And I am, for one, very excited to hear your presentation. And so, Ron, I'm ready to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Carrie. It is so crazy to hear myself called Dr. Ron Hurst. I mean, it just happened in July. I'm still pinching myself, trying to make sure it's real. Man, thank you for that introduction. And everyone, welcome. I'm so excited to be with you this afternoon and to share a little bit of the insights that I gained in my research with you that I think is really practical and important as you consider your coaching practice. Before I do begin, I just want to give you a brief background and who I am and how I came to be here today. And I'm going to keep it short, but I've been a member of the Fielding community since about this time 11 years ago, when I made a very fateful decision to join the EBC program, and I was part of cohort 10. And one of the smartest decisions I ever made, and it fundamentally changed the way I think, the way I act, the way I behave, the way I interact with people. It opened these vistas of inquiry and places where I could go and read that I'd never even thought of. I mean, it was just an amazing thing. I chose Fielding for two reasons. The first reason is I wanted to be a coach. I wanted to be able to help people. And in my career as a manufacturing leader, I found that there was only so much I could do to help my employees succeed. And I knew that I'd just gotten to a point where I'd reached, as they say in economics, the point of diminishing returns. I wasn't learning, I wasn't able to help enough people, and I needed to step out and do my own thing. So actually, Fielding in the EBC program was the genesis of why I did that, and I quit right afterwards and started my own company. The second reason that I came to Fielding was more about how do you help someone that doesn't seem to even want to be helped? I was fascinated by all of the employees that I worked with that sometimes just didn't want to learn. And that question, how do you help someone overcome their own self-imposed learning barriers, was what informed my going through the coaching program, and then 5 years later joining the PhD program, and ultimately turned into, as I'm sure you can appreciate, the question I came to Fielding with, you could drive a truck through it, was so broad. And part of the process of a dissertation is narrowing your focus down to something that's actually doable. And the question that ultimately came into my dissertation is, at what stage of ego development is self-initiated reflective thought, or at what stage of ego development does self-reflective thought emerge? And it really became this powerful question that guided the rest of my Fielding journey. And thank God it was a good question that I was passionate about, because the dissertation process is a little bit difficult and it just grinds you to a pulp. But knowing the purpose of why I was doing it got me through, and you know, I loved it. I can say that now. I didn't love it at the time, but I can say it now. So what I want to do with you is walk you through some of the insights that I gained from going through that process. So I'm going to share my screen. And I want to focus this in on the importance of self-reflection in driving awareness and coaching. If you look at the ICF competencies of a coach, you'll find a lot of things within there that we do on a regular basis. In particular, one of them is helping a client build awareness of where they're at, and then actually helping them find their own solutions, using humanistic psychology to help them find solutions that fit them. And I got thinking about this, and I'm like, what if they can't reflect in the first place? And how do we help them? And it becomes a really important question. And as I went through my research, this was in the back of my mind. Like, what about those times where I'm coaching someone and you're just looking at them and you know that they're just not, they're not getting it. They're not coming with you on this journey. How do you help them? I'm going to bookmark my presentation with 2 quotes. Hold on one second. The first quote comes from Robert Quinn, and you may be familiar with Robert Quinn. He wrote a book called Deep Change. This quote comes from his follow-up book to that. It's Building a Bridge as We Walk on It. And this quote speaks so deeply to both coaching and to leadership and leadership development that I just really want to read it to you and just let you hear what Dr. Quinn is saying. And he says that in reflecting deeply on our behavior, we travel to the center of our existence, and there we find our best self. We then change our patterns of behavior. And as we become more purpose-centered, internally driven, other-focused, and externally open, we more fully integrate who we are with what we're doing. And when I see that quote, I see coaching, I see leader, and it just speaks to me and just fires me up for everything that I get to do on a daily basis. So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of the research that I did and connect it directly to the practicality that is coaching. And then I want to share with you briefly so that you can understand where I'm coming from. I want to share just enough of my research process so that you can appreciate what I did and why the results are meaningful. We'll talk about the results specifically about how individuals at the expert level of development within the model that I use, and I'll speak briefly about the model as well, how they reflect and what that process looks like. And then finally, we'll spend the last of our time together talking directly about the implications to leadership development, to leadership coaching, to education, and some practical advice on things that we can do to help our clients build a deeper reflective practice into their thinking and into their learning. So the first piece, this idea of coaching and why this project, how do they relate? So I mentioned earlier that in the ICF competencies, we hear about this idea of building awareness in the client. And the thing about building awareness is it requires us to be able to look back on what we've experienced and make sense of it. And if you think about it, that's really one of the core things that we as coaches do. And yet, I was reading this article written by Suzanne Cook-Gruder, and she, in describing the levels of ego development, these developmental levels that are part of the adult development construct, she indicated that at this one stage of development, the median level, where 36% of the American population is expected to be, that at this level, that reflective thought emerges. And I thought, emerges? Do you mean to tell me that not all human beings reflect? Because if something's emergent, then it must mean that stages before that, they don't reflect. And I thought, wow, this is really important. So why this project? It's simply because of that statement, that reflective thought emerges at this one level of adult development. And coincident with the emergence of reflective thought is the idea of a third person perspective, so that we can get outside of our own experience and examine it as an object as opposed to a subject. The subject, or the sample that I chose for this research, I thought was really important. I mean, how many times do you read research work in the academic literature and you find out that there was a convenient sample of undergraduate psychology students? And I thought, is that real? I mean, what about people that work in manufacturing and logistics? Are they included in that data? And I think that they're underrepresented. So what I wanted to do with my sample was I chose a distribution center here in Southern California and worked with this one company who was very, very friendly in wanting to support my research. And they gave me access to all of their high potential employees, leads, and supervisors. And we invited that group into this research project. 30 said yes. And we conducted, first of all, an assessment of their level of ego development, and then went into the rest of the research process. But before I go any further, the research that we did with them was on what is called a critical career incident. What do I mean by that? Well, I want you to think about a time when a mistake was made in your career and that there were noticeable implications, perhaps a demotion, a reprimand, a verbal correction. What I have observed in my work with many organizations here in Southern California is that everyone's got a story like this. And I thought this would be the perfect vehicle to help individuals in an interview to uncover some of their reflective thought process by sharing with me an incident, a critical career incident. So we went through this process, and the research process itself was in 2 stages. The first thing is we used the stages ego development model, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But after we took our sample through the stages ego development model and did the assessment, I then blindly had a selection of individuals at 2 different stages of development: the expert level, where reflection is thought to emerge, and then the next level, the achiever level, and then went through a narrative interview that really mirrored in many ways a coaching meeting. You know, there were certain structured questions, but it really was about developing a relationship with the interviewee, and then listening deeply to what they had to say, asking questions that took them a little deeper into their story, and then trying to find some meaning within it. So I'll talk a little bit more about the 2 stages of the interview in a second, but let me just step back and talk about stages, if you're just so that we're all on the same page. The stages model is a model of ego development, and ego development covers the affective, the cognitive, and the social kind of construct of adult development. And we go through these different stages as we go through the lifespan. And what was interesting to me in this model is that it's a more granular level look at how adult development, the continuum of adult development works. In the EBC program, you may recall that we're introduced to Robert Kegan's model, the levels of consciousness. And I was just like blown away by that model when I first saw it. But then I was introduced to this one and realized that it's more granular, it's easier to work with, and there's an assessment that is accessible for a researcher. So I ended up using the stages model and zeroing in on the expert, the achiever. As I said, the expert is where reflection emerges, where the third person emerges. The achiever, the reflective abilities are thought to be developed and capable, and just a completely different ability to reflect. So after doing the stages assessment with these individuals, as I mentioned, I blindly was given 9 different individuals to interview, and the interview guide followed a model by Terry Borton. And Terry Borton in the 1970s did some research with high school students on reflective learning and came up with this relatively famous 3-step model: what, so what, now what. And I like this model because I was working with a sample of people that are working professionals, that many of whom just had a high school education or some college. They might, I think in a couple of cases they had an undergraduate degree, but that was the extent of their education. So I really wanted to use a model that, that would work with any level of education. And this model is very simple. The what is an objective explanation of a certain event that occurred, an experience that in this case, the interviewee had endured, a critical incident, if you will. The so what did that mean to them? What meaning do they associate with that event? And what was the cause of it? And then finally, the now what did they do as a result? What did they change? And what I did with the interview guide was to go through and have them explain to me their critical incident. without a whole lot of interaction or questions from me, just clarification to understand the story. And then after we got through their telling of the story, then I explained to them, I want to walk you through a model, the Borton model, and I'm going to ask you some questions and see if we can make new meaning out of what happened. And this is the process that we followed. And in the second half of the narrative interview, it really modeled a coaching engagement quite closely. As I mentioned, we did 30 people were involved in this, high potential employees, leads, and supervisors from a distribution center here in Southern California. The 9 people that I interviewed were either at the expert or the achiever developmental level, and all of the interviews were blind. And I did that on purpose because I wanted to see if I could deduce what developmental level the person was at based on their responses and their reflective exercises. So the results from this particular research showed that, first of all, this idea of a critical career incident, it absolutely did illustrate self-initiated reflective thought. The question was, what kind of reflective thought? And this is really where it got interesting, that some of the individuals that I interviewed, they had a rudimentary, simple process. And it kind of looked like, when this happens, I do that. It was, you know what, if somebody were to say they take a knee-jerk kind of reaction, like, when this happens, I do this to protect myself. In some cases, the reflective process was just that rudimentary. And in other cases, it was sophisticated to a point where someone would they would review what happened, try and make sense of it, and then try and come up with actions that would keep that type of incident from happening again and see what they learn about themselves in the process. So there was this very wide range of reflective process. And this, for me as a coach, going into this, I was really surprised to see the range of reflective abilities. And knowing that in the future, I'm going to be coaching someone, if they have that rudimentary process, what are the implications to me as a coach? How do I coach someone when the reflective process is so step 1, step 2 done? The analysis of these 9 interviews, I went deep in trying to make sense of them. And what really stood out was that some of the individuals with the more rudimentary reflective processes, they were reflecting only on actions, concrete actions taken. Whereas the more sophisticated processes, they were reflecting not only on the actions taken, but on the thinking that went into the actions. So on thought and action. And this is a very significant difference, because when we can reflect on our thoughts and actions, that is the precursor of the idea of metacognitive thought, where we think about our thinking and really can start to make sense of the process. The other thing that came out of the analysis of those interviews is that the Borton so what step, that middle step where the cause is determined or the meaning is associated, it was not consistently present. And this was very surprising to me as well, because I would have expected that they would have tried to make some meaning of it and understand why it happened. But that wasn't the case. Not consistently did everyone try and understand why what happened. Another thing that in going deeper in the analysis I considered was Lev Vygotsky has this idea of the zone of proximal learning. And I think this is another really serious implication for us as coaches. The idea is that when 2 people get together in a dyad and they're having dialogue and making a solid, really good coaching engagement connection, then the client can actually access a higher level or a later level of ego development consistent with where the coach is at rather than where they're at. And I think this is a really important observation, because someone at the expert level and myself, I'm not at the expert, the achiever, or the next stage up the dualist. It's the pluralist, sorry. I'm actually at the next stage, which is a strategist. So an expert talking to a strategist, they're gaining access to a different stage of abilities in terms of reflection. So some of the people in this in the interviews were able to access later levels of reflective ability. And it's hypothesized that it was because of our interaction. And if you think about yourself as coach, when you're working with a client and they're at an earlier level of development, when trust is created and the dialogue is working effectively, you can do the same thing with them. But there's a consequence of that. Just because they're able to access it with your assistance doesn't mean they're going to be able to access it without you. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, that these developmental milestones, there needs to be lived experience in order to be able to replicate them on one's own. To be able to access them through a coach is one thing, but to live them yourself, you need to get to the same level to be able to consistently access them. So I mentioned earlier this idea of reflection on action versus reflection on thought and action. And I want to make a connection to two really important ideas in this space. One is Argyris and Schoen's idea of single loop and double loop learning. And the other is Jack Mesereau's idea of the different types of reflection. He talks about content, process, and premise reflection. And one of the things that really stood out in my interviews is that reflection on thought and action, so the ability to reflect on our thoughts as well as our actions, is much more consistent with a double loop learning process or process reflection, where we're evaluating and reflecting not just on what happened, but how it happened, the process involved in it happening. What stood out in my interviews was that 5 of the 9 interviewees were able to reflect on thought and action, 4 of whom only reflected on action, like concrete action, which means, and what's really fascinating is 2 of those were at a later developmental level. They were at an achiever level, which was really surprising. So as I did my research and tried to predict the developmental level for these 9 individuals, I got it right 5 out of 9 times. And at first I was crushed. I mean, like, this is my life's journey. I'm going to get all 9 right and everything's going to be golden. No, I got 5 out of 9 right. And I'm like, ay. And then I realized something. The ability to dig in and find out why I didn't get those 4 consistent was more important than getting them right. It led to a deeper analysis. There were some things that I identified that perhaps my own bias as a researcher was playing a role. Operative personality variables, because if personality psychology is different than developmental psychology, so it's entirely possible that personality variables were operative, that were confounding my results. The type of incidents shared, I think, played a role as well, as did the zone of proximal development, as I mentioned earlier, that some were able to access a later stage of development through the dyad working with me. So I think there are some really interesting outcomes from this research. And let's talk a little bit about those. Just thinking about this from a coaching point of view. If a leader isn't able to reflect on thought and action, they're going to struggle in a coaching approach that is highly reflective. And I think from my own experience, all of my coaching approach until I started into this research was highly reflective, because it's just the way that I operate. And I don't think I was even conscious of the fact that I was doing it that way. What I've learned, and I thought about it and say, okay, so what would I do differently? And the first thing is when I'm coaching someone is to leverage tangible exercises, especially if I'm doing group leadership development. I will involve people in kinesthetic exercises, whether it involves problem solving or teamwork or some kind of exercise that allows people to be a part of a hands-on process. And what happens is that after you do the exercise and you ask them to reflect on what happened and why they didn't perform at the level that was expected, if they struggle with a thought-based reflective process, then they're going to struggle again in the reflection. But what this does is it starts to open them up to the idea that there's more to reflection than just reflecting on the action taken. So we can actually start to model for them how to think about an exercise like that. Another idea relates back to Robert Kegan, who I mentioned, and his levels of consciousness. In Robert Kegan's model, he references the use of subject-object interviews to identify a person's level of operative consciousness. And this idea of subject-object I find absolutely fascinating. You know, something that is object, that's out here in the world in front of us, can be examined from a number of different perspectives. Whereas something that's subject, that's part of us, part of our own mental framework or schema, it's very difficult to reflect on. So one of the things that I love to do when I'm working with my coaching clients now is I leverage writing exercises or pictorial exercises, draw pictures, and get the ideas of what you're asking them to reflect on onto a piece of paper. Because the minute it's on a piece of paper out here, now they can look at it from multiple perspectives again, and they can start to gain access to more of an object point of view as opposed to a subject point of view, which is they're really going to struggle with. So I think these two particular approaches will make working with someone who's not yet able to reflect on thought and action a little bit better at the reflective process, and will start to model how to get to reflecting on thought. The other thing that I think is really important to consider when working with a client and you're not certain of their reflective ability is to start with a very simple reflective question. And I mean, imagine asking a client early in an engagement, tell me about a time you faced a setback. What'd you learn? And what changes did you make? And if you ask a question like this, how they respond is going to give you some very important insights into what they're capable of doing from a reflective learning perspective. First of all, are they able to objectively state an incident that occurred to them? And can they do it in an objective way as opposed to a subjective way? Can they relate the emotionality of that particular incident from a third-person perspective, like I was really angry at the time, without getting back into the emotionality of it? So are they able to identify and create an object of that experience? Next, think about, so that's the what step. Think about the so what step now. Are they able to identify the cause of what caused that incident? Because often what I find with people who are at earlier levels of development is that they have a tendency to point fingers at someone else, say, well, they did that to me. And they don't look at it from an internal perspective and go, what was my role in this? So looking for the sense of causation, and do they have clarity on what caused the event in the first place, I think is another important step in trying to deduce where their reflective ability is at. And likewise, what meaning do they associate with it? Are they able to move beyond just a simple kind of knee-jerk, well, if this happens, then I got to protect myself? Are they able to look at it objectively and go, yeah, I had some role in that, and here's what I learned about myself as a result? And then finally, the now what step, are they able to identify an action based on what they learned about themselves that they can take in the future that will enable them to see that type of incident coming and not fall into it again? So if they're not able to do that, then chances are that they're either at an earlier level of development in terms of their reflective ability, or they've never been mentored in how to make sense of the incidents that occur in their life in the first place. And either way, if we as a coach engage someone and ask them to reflect on what an incident that has happened to them, we're likely to get a fairly short answer. And if we keep going back to the same types of questions to get them to think about their thinking, we're likely to frustrate them to a point where they're not going to want to work with us, because they're not going to get the value if they get frustrated that the question doesn't make sense to them. So I think if we as coaches develop a better sense of our own reflective ability and the reflective ability of the client that's in front of us, then I think we can really begin to live the ICF competencies at a deeper level, where we do consider that client as whole and complete and capable of finding their own solutions. But now we meet them where they're at instead of inviting them to go somewhere where we're at. Because I think in the end, if we're going to help someone develop themselves, we got to start with where they're at, not where we are. There are a couple of places I'm going to go with my research that I think this is just so fascinating. I want to go deeper on this model and involve a larger cohort, a larger sample size, and see if I can make some sense of a more nuanced model of reflective thought. I want to potentially look at non-critical career incidents as a focal point. Like when you propose marriage to someone, I think that would be a really cool critical incident to think about. And I also have thought a lot about the idea of seeing how personality intersects with reflective thought processes and trying to tease out the difference of how different personalities approach reflective thought. The final thing is the stage before the expert in the ego development model is a stage called conformist. And this is a stage that is pre-emergent of reflective thought. And I wasn't able to include them in my research because no one tested at that level, but I would very much like to include some people at that level so I can really bracket the reflective thought of the expert by seeing what comes before it and what comes after it. And I think in the end, if we're able to really meet people where they're at and understand how they reflect and use their current level of reflection in a positive and constructive way, I really do think we can help our clients to climb and find the solutions that they're looking for in their life. I began this talk with a quote, and I want to end it with a quote from one of my other favorite researchers, Daniel Kahneman, who's famous for the book Thinking Fast and Slow. I love this book, and it's informed a lot of my thinking around cognitive biases and heuristics. But Daniel Kahneman, in a November 2011 interview, said that if there is time to reflect, then slowing down is likely to be a good idea. And I would encourage all of you that as you think about working with your clients, I think we should slow down a little bit and figure out where they're at. What is their reflective ability at? And meet them there. And I think if we can do that, we can change the lives of a lot of people.
There is one question in the chat, and Elisa has that question, but the thought that's top of mind for me after hearing that is don't do something, just stand there. It's the opposite of don't just stand there, go do something. It's no, don't just do something, stand there. And that kind of reverse thinking to get people to be reflective is almost like the opposite can sometimes be a way of getting through to them. But another potential opposite approach is what Elisa is bringing up. And Elisa, if you'd like to add more to the question, please feel free to take yourself off mute. But her question is how do you explore reflective thought using appreciative inquiry? And do you see that potentially as an opposite approach?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because I did focus in on something that it could be argued was kind of going into the negative, into the critical, into something emotion laden. And I did that purposely because I wanted to find something highly salient to someone who might not otherwise reflect. I love appreciative inquiry, and I'm a big fan of that whole school of thought. And in much of my coaching, absolutely. I mean, one of my key goals is to build awareness and help people grow the confidence that they have of their own emerging abilities. So I don't see it as an opposite. I actually see them as completely complementary. And one of the things that I was able to do in the last couple of months was, and it absolutely relates to the connection of the two, was working with a group in another distribution center here in Southern California. And I had across 3 cohorts about 50 individuals again, ranging from a bachelor's degree down to a high school diploma. And I taught them the Borton model. And then I walked them, and it was in a leadership class. So I walked them through, if you're familiar with Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, I walked them through his list of blind spots that leaders often come up against. And I asked them to reflect, which ones of these, if I were to ask one of your employees, which ones of these would they say you do? And we built enough of a relationship that we were able to get there. But then I taught them how to reflect on it, how to make meaning from it. And the entire process from when they identified this opportunity through to when we concluded with presentations and self-disclosure was one of absolutely positive inquiry and really affirmations of what they're learning and how they're growing. And this community of support and care came out of it. So I see them as complementary, not opposites or not contradictory at all.
Ron, I'm curious, what's your use of, or how have you integrated the maturity assessment that there's that assessment on adult development? I'm curious if you've integrated that at all into your research.
To some extent, the ego development model does incorporate that already. And it's measured through the ego development model is a sentence stem completion test where you get partial sentence and then they just fill it out in any way they want. And depending on your level of emotional maturity, you're obviously going to fill it out differently. And that can be the patterns and the thousands of sentence completion tests start to parse that out. As for an actual test that measures emotional maturity, I would love to get into that, and I haven't done so yet, but I tend to use a pragmatic approach and figure out the level of emotionality versus the situation, but I love the idea of incorporating it. I just haven't done so yet.
Looks like there's Fernando has a question. Have you thought about exploring reflective thought in reference to military personnel and veterans? That's Fernando's sweet spot.
Wow. I have many friends who are veterans of the U.S. military, and anytime I have an opportunity to serve them, I jump at it. As for this particular model, I've shared it with a couple of my veteran friends, but not beyond really looking at the what, so what, now what. To do research with that group, I think that there are some IRB considerations that I would be very careful of, specifically around the TBI and PTSD and the impact that might have, because that's not my area of expertise. So I would have to be exceptionally careful in how you approach it. But I think it could be very valuable if they didn't have the skill set to reflect through an incident. I think it would be valuable for them to have it. Now, the one thing I will say is that Borton's model is an absolute echo of the American military's after-action review. It's the exact same 3 steps. So it's entirely possible that the military may have a leg up in terms of being able to process through the reflective model that I used in this research.
Well, and Fernando, I'm curious, what do you think as you're listening to this? And I know this is such an area of interest to you. Let's say a little bit more behind your question. Oh, and Fernando, you're still on mute, my friend. Try again. We still can't hear you. Still can't hear you. I know you've had trouble with your mic or with your your microphone before. Hopefully you can figure it out. Oh, yay, now we can hear you.
There he is.
There I am. No, Ron, I got and Carrie knows this. It's true and dear to my heart. I did 31 years in the military and government. I understand where you're coming from, PTSD, TBI, combat. and offline, I would like to talk to you more about it because of where I want to go with it in a sense of what I want to do. But the reason why I ask this is because you have reservists who are a lot in business, conducting business.
Hmm.
They're doing the military, go to war, come back, and still have to carry themselves in a business format, whether it's at a high level, low level, in any level.
Right.
But I think if you approach that with a veteran, I know that Fielding has a group of veterans who are all going through different studies together. I think in that aspect, it could open up a lot of doors, and it would help, I feel, a better understanding within the U.S. veteran group and all that.
Hmm.
The government does have something for veterans, but it's not all there. It's a white paper, it's a study.
Right.
The way they conduct it is not always pertinent to what is really being felt at the actual lower level of an individual, which is PTSD. And this is something that is important for an individual that has PTSD, TBIs, been through all that, that can actually reflect on oneself to understand things a lot better than not. And I found what you said very interesting in a helping way to individuals that do have PTSD.
I think the biggest benefit it could have, if I may, is especially if someone doesn't have the current kind of mental structure of knowing how to make sense of their experience, to gain the process. And that's really what I was trying to do with the example I shared with the leadership class, was teach them how to use this tool to see if they would be able to do it on their own. The one important thing is that development is a process, not an event. And the developmental transition from one stage to the next can take 6, 12, 24 months. So teaching them something once or coaching someone 1 or 3 times is probably not going to get them to the outcome, but it's a start. And I think if there was a support system where people could learn to be able to make sense of their experience in a deeper way, I think that would be an incredibly powerful thing, especially for our veteran community.
I agree.
So, sorry to cut you off. It's just, yeah, I love what you're saying.
And I'd like to talk to you more about it. Maybe I'll find some time.
Yeah, love to.
Thanks, Fernando. Ron, there's another comment question in the chat box from Zara, and it says coaches are expected to use techniques to motivate and move clients to reflexive mindset. Can we also use metaphors and allegories? What's your reaction to that?
I think that it's something that I've experimented with often, and the one thing I think we always have to be careful of is that their experience is not ours. So it's one of the things I remember when I was in EBC 10 and doing one of those kind of intensive things in the hotel room where I was the coach and one of my fellow students was the coachee, and I asked the question, and it was clear that the question, I thought it was an awesome question. I mean, I thought about it and it was excellent. And then my fellow student, it was like it fell dead on the floor. And I thought, wow, that was a really good question. And then I reminded myself, I'm not here for me. I'm here for them. It doesn't matter how good my question is. It matters whether the question lands for them. So I think the reason I share that is that I've learned to get my own ego out of the way. And if the question is no good for the client, then it's just save it for later, maybe, but for another client, but don't worry about it. Find another question. If you're going to use a metaphor or an allegory, recognize that your experience is not theirs and your metaphors, your allegories may not fit their context, and be prepared that it's just not going to land, and throw it away and use another one. I love them, but they got to fit the client.
Well, I also think there's such a lovely and graceful way of really listening to the client's metaphors and allegories. and then asking them to say more. Like, what does that metaphor mean to you? And I think that could be a really nice way of moving into some reflexive mindset work as a coach. But we have to hear it. We really have to listen for it.
There was one of my fellow students in EBC 10. There was this moment in our last session where, and I guess I'm allowed to share this because we were just pretend coaching, right? It's not like protected or anything, but he was coaching this other student, and this other student was reflecting on the transition from high school student children to college age children, empty nest syndrome, and how this would, and she said this would be the last summer that our family was together. And the coach in this particular session, he said, the last summer. How can you make the last summer the best summer? And I'll never forget that moment. It was absolutely magical. Being able to use the client's own metaphor, their own kind of image, and make it a construct that they could hold on to and embrace and celebrate. It was such a beautiful moment. I have to confess, when I coach somebody, I look for those now. Because they're just so powerful when you find them.
Andy's wondering, you mentioned that you'd like to do research with individuals at higher developmental levels. What do you think that would look like, and what kind of results would you expect to see there?
Well, it would be fun to do the model that I did on coaches, for instance, because in my experience, the coaches I've interacted with tend to operate at a higher ego development level to begin with. And one of the fascinating things is that I think coaches understand how this model works intuitively, and they would be fun to interview, because you just ask them, tell me about a critical career incident, and they just and walk you through everything, the entire incident, what they learned from it, what the root cause was, what meaning they associated with it, what actions they took, and why the initial actions weren't good enough. So they dug back in, did a double loop again, and came back out the other side. I think that if you go to the higher levels, it would be an absolute joy. I mean, you just sit back and allow them to do all the work. What I'm fascinated by are the people that are not there yet, and how to help them make sense of their experience. So that, how many times do we see someone that encounters a roadblock or a disappointment only to have it happen again in the future? And is it because they're not able to make sense of their experience? I think that that's part of it.
Well, and Andy, I encourage you to take yourself off mute if you'd like to add anything to that question.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. That was great. I was wondering, what would you expect to see? Like, what kind of results would come out of that? What meaning would that have for the person at the higher level? Like, what's next for them?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And I think the best a coach can do in that situation is to reflect back what they're hearing, so that it becomes even more object for the client, and they can re-examine it again through the reflection. And obviously in a paraphrase way, where we're saying, well, here's what I'm thinking I'm getting from what you're saying. Is that correct? And then they can wrestle with the idea again. I think the later stages of development have the ability to reflect already. And what I find in my own personal experience is it's incredibly powerful when you have someone that you can talk to that can do that for you, so that you can wrestle with your own thoughts. In fact, it's one of the things I do with my own business is I've sought out mentors and I've told this one mentor that I have, I just need you to listen to me and ask me questions when what I'm saying doesn't make sense, because how else am I going to grow? And I think that that's one of the things that we can do for later stage development, is to be the sounding board, to be the reflection, to be the place where they can come to wrestle with their own meaning that they're creating.
Yeah, it's sort of that stop doing and being, at those later stages, the way of being becomes the conversation, much less the action that they're going to take.
Right. Exactly right.
Remaining 6-7 minutes here, I encourage anyone who'd like to interact and take yourself off mute and even let us see you. Such a rich conversation. This is one of my favorite topics in coaching, so I've just been eating it up. Is there anything else that you guys would like to dialogue on? See, Zara has another one here. You made a brief reference to the importance and role of personality traits in reflection. Oh, I'm glad you're asking that. I had a question about that too. What specific personality variable for research? I'm curious what you were using.
Thank you for asking this, because what really fascinated me as I dug into the interviews in my research was that two of the participants, although they tested at a higher level of development, the achiever level, when I interviewed them, I'm like, is there any, there's no emotion. It just seemed like there was no depth of reflection. And I found myself, as a coach, I'm in this space trying to hold the space, make it safe, make it effective, learn deeply. And I'm constantly aware of this growing sense of frustration in myself. And I'm managing that, but still I'm aware of it. And after the interview was done, I was asking myself, what was frustrating me? And I thought back to a couple of researchers who talked about the difference between the sensing and the intuition function in the Myers-Briggs model. And I know for myself that my intuition is off the chart. I mean, the guy that scored me, he was shocked that it was like the highest number he'd ever seen. And what struck me was that these two individuals, the more I thought back to the interview, I realized that they seemed like the way they took in information was through the sensing modality. And I know that in the past, when I've worked for, I used to work for an ESTJ, for instance, and I'm an ENTP, and he used to drive me to distraction and collecting data for no apparent reason, it seemed to me. But so I wondered if that personality variable was playing a role. And then the other variable that I thought was interesting, and I just stayed within the Myers-Briggs framework because I think it's a really a good model to consider, the decision-making functionality of feeling versus thinking. And what struck me is that I saw some individuals who were quite expressive in their emotionality in their interview, and others that were there was nothing. I mean, it was just complete logic, nothing else, like Mr. Spock kind of interview. And I wondered if that was impacting my ability to analyze their transcript. So if I were to do more research, those are the two variable domains that I would really want to look at in personality. Is there a difference between the sensor and the intuitor, if you will, in their ability to reflect? And the same with those people who make decisions based on the thinking function versus the feeling function. And there is some research that suggests that developmental transitions are aided by the intuitive function that people with the sensing function may find more difficult. So I thought that was a really important observation.
Really glad, Zara, you asked that question, because I don't think there's enough research around whether it's I love the Myers-Briggs, and so I think that is a really strong way of assessing preferences, maybe more so than personality, but preferences linked with ego development, adult development. I would love to see more correlated work. Great gap, perhaps, to continue to explore for those on the call who are thinking about a future PhD. Fernando, which you're already enrolled for January, I'm very excited about. But yeah, there's so much work to still explore around adult development. Ron, I know we only have a few minutes left, and I just want to give you a warm thank you. This has been a delightful webinar, and such great content and a great example of how the research continues to inform practice, especially the coaching practice. Everything you talked about today is really foundational to our success. Yeah, and I think there's a few people here saying fascinating, stimulating session, very good. So we will stay on for a couple more minutes if there are other questions or comments. And if not, yes, applause, thank you. And I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. This is a rough week, and so be good to yourself. Get some rest tonight if you didn't get any last night.
Still waiting for answers.
I know, Jenny, it's so good to see you. Peggy, Jane, Maria, Sarah, Lisa, Marion, Shelby, so good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
Hi, Jenny.
Are you going to post where we can take the survey?
Oh, yeah, let me do it again. I did it earlier in the chat. Here it is
Oh,
again.
I see it is. Oh, okay, I missed it.
No problem. Thank you for asking again. And we will make sure the recording is added to the fielding website. That typically happens within the next 48 to 72 hours. We'll get it up there. And then it'll be available and we can share it with others. So feel free to access that again and share it because this was great content.
No, it is. Hey, Ron, I really appreciate it. Put my thought into something else while you were talking. I was listening to it because, like Carrie said, in January I started a program.
Congratulations.
And all of this I'm absorbing, so it's where I want to go. But a lot of the concentration is going to be dealing with veterans,
Right.
And part of it is communication, and dive into the aspect of the response and the reaction towards
Right.
how that person relates to it. And it dives into, like you said, ego.
Yeah, it does.
So,
and you mentioned, Fernando, you mentioned another really important word that I want to just, give all props to the EBC program, that communication requires there to be a really good listener to get it right. And that's something I was shocked at how much better a listener I became after the EBC program and changed my life. But how many times do we meet people that really don't know how to communicate very well? They think they are, but they stopped learning how to do it when they left formal education.
Yep. No, you're right.
It drives me insane because I ask people all the time, how good a listener do you think you are on a scale of 1 to 10? And they're like, oh, 7 or 8, or like, I'm like, really? And then we go through and I teach them how to listen, and they're like, okay, son, how good of a listener are you on a scale of 1 to 10? They're like, 4. I'm like, that's better.
Yeah.
Carol, I'm gonna go ahead and allow you to pause the recording and end the live stream. And again, I'll leave us in here for maybe another minute or two. And for the rest of you, please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.